What's up everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today's video has really been a long time coming. This is an issue I've discussed several times before in my ANCAP videos, especially in the videos about healthcare and medicine, but this is a really great opportunity to spell out a lot of the details as to why I am convinced that so-called intellectual property is not actually property at all. For starters, I've recently uploaded the audio form of Boldrin and Levine's Against Intellectual Monopoly, which is a much more in-depth takedown of the topic than I could ever hope to offer here, and it's written by actual experts on the issue. I've also uploaded an audiobook of Stephan Kinsella's Against Intellectual Property, which is a much shorter and more easily digestible book done by yet another expert and professional patent lawyer who, like me, is a fan of the Austrian School of Economics. So all of us, those two books I mentioned, me, pretty common in the ANCAP, more hardcore libertarian spheres, we are typically against intellectual property, the concept of it. Specifically, I was asked to do a rebuttal to Razorfist's Defense of Intellectual Property video titled "The Public Domain is an Ass." The link to his video is in the description box below because it's an 18-minute video and I will not be able to cover all of it in all details. I just want to rebut some of the more specific points that he makes and give my arguments in opposition. I want to preface this as much as I can, by the way, by saying I do enjoy plenty of Razorfist content, especially his cinema series, which is incredible. I think the man is intelligent. I have a lot of respect for him. I just think he's on the complete wrong side of this issue. And I should also add that about a year and a half ago, back when I was still using Twitter, Razorfist and I had several back and forths on this particular topic, and I was underwhelmed, to say the least, with what I feel was his persistent ignoring of my actual arguments against his position, and his seeming refusal to acknowledge that despite how many times he linked me his video, the video itself is only a claim, it is not proof of the claim. I get that you made a video, dude. I'm disagreeing with what you say in the video. Not only do I disagree with it, a lot of experts do as well. He also, in that discussion, refused to engage with Stephan Kinsella because Kinsella has a much smaller following than he does, which I also found very disappointing. But again, I like plenty of Razor's content. I'm glad he keeps making it. And well, let's just dig into the meat of this issue because this video is probably already going to be long enough as it is. So let's look at some of Razorfist's arguments in favor of intellectual property.
My argument today is not going to be utilitarian in nature, at least not primarily. My argument is moral and philosophical in nature. Copyright and patent isn't good because it works. It works because it's good. The right to the labor of your mind is not an invention of the government or a device of bureaucratic control, although its rollback certainly is, as I will demonstrate. It is a human right. Period. Whether acknowledged and enshrined by law or subverted by the very same. To deny the product of a man's mind is to deny the very concept of property itself.
Alright, so first off, I'm glad he doesn't go for the utilitarian arguments in favor of patent and copyright because personally I tend to find utilitarianism to be the least interesting basis for argumentation with almost any topic, but I do think the utilitarian case against patent and copyright are enormous. But I'm glad we can skip that and dig right into the much more satiating deontological sphere. Here, Razor makes the case that intellectual property is, quote, a human right, and, quote, to deny the product of a man's mind is to deny the very concept of property itself. He goes on in detail in an attempt to strengthen this argument.
Because the mind is not only a man's property, it's about the only property no other earthly man can touch without our consent. But the Antifa-tards and the party of pot that calls itself the libertarians these days, in arguing against IP, miss the point hardest when they fail to acknowledge that all property is intellectual property. If a man's mind is his primary interface with the world and preeminent instrument of survival, then it's not with his brawn, but with his intellect that a man erects his own dwelling or purchases it. Not with his biceps, but with his brain that he builds a bicycle. Recognizing the physical property that results from it, but not the primacy of the intelligence that created it, is like blaming the beat and nut sweat on the sack of your progenitor for your fucking birth, rather than the will of your parents themselves.
Razor's argument is that since all action in creation begins in the mind, all property therefore is intellectual property. Hearing this again after all this time reminds me exactly why we were talking past each other on Twitter. He's using the term intellectual property in a completely different way than it is historically and legally used. The reason we have a distinction between general property And intellectual property is because, and I'll use the Wikipedia definition for this, intellectual property is a category of property that includes intangible creations of human intellect. This distinction isn't trivial, let alone non-existent. It's the entire basis of the dispute. The difference matters because when we're talking about copyright and patent, we're talking about a legal distinction over intangible, non-scarce concepts. So to really start this rebuttal off, we need to define some of these terms that we're discussing. First and foremost, we have to define what property is. It may seem obvious, but the subtle differences in definitions can lead to a lot of disagreement down the road. The simplest definition I can give for property is that property refers typically to items or objects that have either been homesteaded by a first user, or items or objects that have been voluntarily or contractually exchanged between parties. So why are property rights important? Property rights are crucial because ultimately they are the basis of all rights. There are no rights without property rights, starting from an individual having the sole claim of ownership over themselves. Property rights bring about a system in which claims of property ownership can be disputed and thus have to be justified. This introduces the ultimate need for property rights, and that is rivalrousness. Rivalrousness here simply means the contention or dispute over ownership of property. If it were not for rivalrousness, there would be no need for property rights. This takes us to another crucial component of property, and that is the concept of scarcity. If something is infinitely abundant, and it can be made infinitely abundant without damaging, destroying, or removing the original something, we refer to that as being non-scarce. Without scarcity, property rights are meaningless, and they do not apply. I'll give you an example. So let's say I have this really nice car in my driveway right now. Now you come along and you take it. Is that theft? If it is, why is it theft? Is this a violation of my property rights? Is it theft because you now have a car that you didn't earn? Well, no, because in this case, whether or not you earned a car, it might cause some grudges or some moral judgments on my part, but whether or not you earned a car is ultimately subjective. Either way, my feelings of that you didn't earn something now doesn't mean that you can't justifiably own that thing I feel like you didn't earn. So we can eliminate that possibility as a reason for theft. Is it theft because I wasn't using it at the time and now you have a right to essentially re-homestead my car? Well, no, because regardless of whether or not I was using it at the time, is irrelevant to the fact that I signed the paperwork, I agreed to exchange a certain amount of money, and in return the car would belong to me. I never gave up my right of ownership to the car. So that takes us right to the heart of the issue. The reason you taking my car constituted theft is because I am now without my car. You didn't just get a car, I lost one. This transaction wasn't merely not to my liking either. I never agreed to it in the first place. This is what scarcity means in terms of property. It is a non-voluntary zero-sum outcome. Now imagine again that I had a really nice car sitting out in my driveway, and while walking down the street you see my car and think, wow, it's a really sweet ride, I'd love to have one of those. So you take a picture of my car. Did you wrong me? Has there been a property rights violation? No, there hasn't. My car is out in the open. It hasn't been damaged or stolen by you taking a picture of it, unless maybe I could argue some petty, really useless argument about taking pictures of my publicly displayed things without my consent maybe, but still no property right has been violated in this scenario. Well, what if you come by, you see my car, and you think, wow, that's a sweet ride, I want one of those, and instead of the normal camera, you have an advanced piece of technology that when you take a picture of my car, it essentially creates an exact replica. From the color of my car's finish, down to the exact amount of gas in the tank and air in each tire. Have you wronged me? No, of course you haven't. My property is still intact. No damage has been done to me. I have no justifiable claim that you don't own this new car of yours that you've brought into existence via this futuristic technology. This analogy tells us now something about property rights, and that is that scarcity is a prerequisite. If we could just reach into the sky and pull out any item we wanted at will, then the concept of private property and property rights would be meaningless. But we don't live in such a reality, so we have to go about figuring all of this out. This is why I oppose the idea of intellectual property, because what it actually is, when you look behind the curtain of propaganda, is just another system of unjustifiable institutionalized monopoly. A man absolutely has the sole ownership and right of his mind and his ideas. But those ideas, once expressed, once written down, once recorded, once published, filmed, whatever, those ideas are no longer scarce. You no longer hold exclusive ownership of those thoughts, those ideas, those concepts. They can be spread and replicated. They can be copied endlessly without removing, damaging, or destroying that original source in your mind. Thomas Jefferson used the analogy of someone lighting their candle off of his flame.
On questions of duration, reasonable minds may differ. The author's life plus 50 years seems marginally reasonable to me, though I would advance the argument that if an author, filmmaker, or fucking ninjutsu instructor erects an empire of any consequence, imparts to his progeny the significance of it, and deigns that when he dies, his family should inherit not just his fortune, but the product of his mind as well, provided some manner of condition for his legacy's continuance be satisfied, who in nine hoary hells are you or the federal government to intercept that property, deny it to the family, and dispense it to the unwashed masses in direct contravention of that fucking desire?
Who I am is a human being with property rights, and I don't have a right to the individual creator you're referring to's product or property, but I am justified in using my mind to take in information from the world around me and use my own property however the hell I want to. To say otherwise, again, is to oppose my property rights in my own materials. Taken to its logical conclusion, copyright and patent, especially pushed to the extremes that many, including Razorfist here from this comment, seem to support, is perpetual copyright and patent. No limitation on the duration of an IP right. On one side, in their defense, if you're going to argue that IP is the same as any other form of property, then at least they're being consistent. If you own physical property and you wanted to pass it down to your child and so on, and to your progeny, then you're entirely justified in doing so since you own the property. IP, however, does not pass this test, and I've just explained why, because it, at least in my opinion, just does not meet the qualifications of property. But one can imagine the utilitarian arguments that could easily be made against perpetual copyright and patent, having to pay the descendants of the first caveman who left the cave and built a hut out of wood, paying royalties to the first human descendants who cooked their meat with fire, that put seasoning on it, etc. You know where this goes. You don't owe Ayn Rand in perpetuity for the principles and philosophy you learned from her work. It was replicated endlessly. I learned from it, you learned from it, millions of people have learned from it. The only thing we owe Ayn Rand and the other giants whose shoulders we've stood on is an ethic-based level of respect, not the seeking of permission slips or legal reparations in perpetuity.
The inventor isn't swiping shit because this thing did not previously exist. He is creating value. And if the bass-ackwards argument that creating value is somehow stealing it from the masses sounds eerily familiar, it's because it's the philosophical bedrock of the shrinking markets theory, which is the economic bedrock of all brands of butt-fucking socialism.
Razor also insinuates at times, but at other times flat out makes the case, that opposition to IP rights is the embracing of socialism. Basically that opposing intellectual property is some commie shit. Ironically, however, his entire premise for property rights being a result of creation seems to be rooted in the Marxist concept of labor theory of value. And here's the reality. Creation is not a source of property. If you take materials you already justifiably own, such as metal, wood, glue, and a spring, and you use it to build a mousetrap, you do not now own the mousetrap because you've created it. You own it because you already justifiably owned all the materials that went into making the mousetrap. If someone else holds a monopoly on an intangible concept of a mousetrap, they now, in a limited but very real and egregious sense, own the limitations of what you're allowed to do with your own justifiably owned property. Patent and copyright are, in this sense, a total violation of your property rights to use your own time, resources, labor, and materials however you see fit.
Economists who chart human development use the shorthand of the hockey stick graph, meaning if a line graph were drafted of the advancement of humanity from the beginning of recorded time to the present, it starts as a fucking plateau, then beginning in the late 18th and early 19th century, it fires off the fucking Neptune. What many economists, particularly, sadly, of the Austrian variety, often neglect to acknowledge is that this sudden surge in technological advancement perfectly coincides with the advent of intellectual property protections in the United States.
This is a very common myth about IP. Patent and copyright encourage and are the sole, or at least the main reason innovation exists in the market. In this case, Razor's arguing that IP explains why we had the explosion in wealth and creation of the early 19th century. The reality, again, though, is that there are an endless amount of studies done by dozens of institutions and researchers that suggest not only is it not the case that patent and copyright encourage innovation in the market, but it actually harms new technology, economic activity, and societal wealth. Hell, Boldrin and Levine dedicated an entire chapter of their Against Intellectual Monopoly book just to dispel this particular myth. But one need look no further than the modern age of near instantaneous access to art, music, movies, books, and all forms of entertainment and information literally at a man's fingertips, which all can be found, accessed, traded, copied, and enjoyed for free. Yet despite the reality that never before in human history has more new art, music, movies, books, and entertainment been created than now in that same modern age. The explosion of wealth during the 19th century was a result of a system of property rights, for sure, but to suggest that includes government-granted monopolies on concepts goes against everything we know about functioning markets. Monopolies don't help innovation and wealth unless you are the holder of said monopoly. This is made even more obvious when you realize that patent and copyright monopolies had been in place centuries before the US was even founded, across different nations, in different ways, with different applications and criteria, all the way back to ancient Greece in 500 BC. There was an understanding and granting of intellectual property, yet we never saw anything even remotely close to what happened in the 19th century. The key ingredients to the wealth explosion in the 19th century was property rights, not monopoly rights. Hell, the original discussion we had on Twitter began with Razorfists grenading lefties with truth bombs about natural monopoly not existing in free markets absent government intrusion. I loved every tweet that he made on the issue, and I very much enjoyed watching lefty heads explode at that undeniable reality. It's just unfortunate to see Razor stop there before acknowledging that IP laws are one of the biggest cudgels government uses to enshrine those monopoly powers on those same market actors.
This ain't just about being cranky about a cartoon fucking mouse, folks. It's about allowing people to profit from what their mind makes, leaving the wheels of creativity unfettered.
And again, if you use your mind to create something, you have every right to do as you see fit with this creation. It's your property, and no one has a right to tell you what you can and cannot do with it, of course, as long as it doesn't impose on anyone else. The actual issue opponents of IP like myself are raising is that you cannot forcefully prohibit anyone else from using their own goddamn property however they see fit. Yes, you have to show that you created something to get a patent, but the patent doesn't grant you a property right in the thing that you've created. It grants you a property right to the mere concept of the thing that you've created. And I've already shown here why that's absurd, imposing, and is a violation of the property rights of others. And I'll wrap this up here because a lot of the arguments he ends up making are responses to utilitarian concerns. I think I've covered most, if not all, of my main arguments here, so I'll just say until next time, stay safe, live free, and abolish IP.